Hey everybody, Ethan here. Today I'm going to talk about secretory diarrhea and enterotoxigenic E. coli, also known as ETEC. I want to first, though, address the sort of elephant in the room. This topic, as well as the slide color, evokes a very specific emotional reaction. And I'd say it evokes the reaction that you see in these three faces, that being disgust. And I acknowledge that, because in terms of the tiers of grossness, if unpleasant is a mild to moderate brain freeze after drinking a slushy, distasteful is deciding whether or not to eat food that's kind of sort of going bad, and utterly revolting is seeing someone pick their nose and eat the booger. I would say secretory diarrhea and ETEC is firmly in the middle, firmly in disgusting. And I get it, right? If you Google pictures of it, you get stuff like this, and I had to censor it for your own sakes. It's really not great. And that's the truth. But that disgust factor shouldn't obscure the fact that diarrhea is really, really important, right? It's one of the leading causes of death worldwide, especially in children. And while this morbidity and mortality is generally concentrated in lower and middle income countries with greater risk factors such as poor sanitation, the impact isn't just limited there. Especially when you look at the videos I've published on this channel, a lot of this stuff is generally rare. It's possible that many people, average person, never heard of these things and never will, knock on wood, experience these things either. But when it comes to secretory diarrhea, it's completely different. Seriously, I'd be shocked if you haven't experienced, or at least someone you know has experienced. I'd be shocked if that's the case, because really, it's very common and it's in the news all the time. So given that, let's talk about it. So what am I going to talk about today? One, what is secretory diarrhea? How does it work? Two, what is ETEC? And three, how does ETEC cause secretory diarrhea? So starting with secretory diarrhea, I actually want to first take a step back and talk about stool, or more broadly, I'll just say poop. Right, here is the Bristol stool chart, giving us more concrete definitions of the different consistencies of stool that are possible. And generally, when we think of diarrhea, we're thinking about types 6 and 7 here. We're talking about semi-liquid to liquid stool. And the key difference between this liquid stool or diarrhea and what we see here, these sort of lumpy, harder stool that you see here, associated with constipation, in a word, the difference is fluid content. I realize that's two words. I don't know why I said in a word. In two words, the difference is fluid content. You get semi-liquid or liquid stool, simply put, because there is more liquid in the stool. And really that liquid is most often just water. I like to think of the difference between the two as this difference between, say, this hard caked dirt you might see in a desert and what happens to that dirt after a rainstorm, which is it turns into mud. The difference between mud and hard, dry, caked dirt, there really is no intrinsic difference apart from, of course, the addition of water to make the mud. And I think this sort of analogy is illustrative because I think it's important to remember that when it comes to diarrhea, what I will keep hammering home to you today is that it fundamentally is simply a disorder of having more fluid content in stool. You might wonder then, though, given that we're talking about more fluid content in stool or water content in stool, could I cause diarrhea? Could I precipitate diarrhea simply by drinking, pardon the pun, a crap ton of water? The answer is, unless you are in an extreme case, no. And the reason why comes down to intestinal physiology. Even if you drink a ton of water, you have to understand that the GI tract has a significant capacity to absorb water, around 15 liters per day. So given that, what generally controls stool fluid content is not necessarily how much fluid you drink, but actually the carefully calibrated balance of absorption and secretion across the intestinal epithelium that you see here. What generally counts, in short, isn't what you put in, it's what you can take in. And what you can take in is governed by what you can see on the screen here, which is the transporters that exist on this intestinal epithelium. It's filled with transporters to shuttle, ions, macromolecules, nutrients from the lumen into the cells, and that makes sense, right? Because a lot has to come in. Because what is the goal of the GI tract? What's the primary goal? The primary goal is to get the nutrients out of food. If I eat a sandwich, I want all those nutrients to come into my body, right? That's the whole point of eating the sandwich, apart from the fact that it tastes good. But really, it's important, right? The GI tract needs to take nutrients out, so it needs to be a lot of transporters to absorb nutrients from the lumen, from the food, into the cells. And what you see on the left-hand side here is a bit of an oversimplification. There's actually a lot more transporters involved, but it's a good summary of those that at least are implicated in diarrhea. You've got these transporters that move sodium, glucose, other ions from the lumen into the cell. And the point is that as these things move into the cell, what's coming along with them is water. Recall osmosis, right? If you have a semi-permeable membrane, the flow of solutes, in our case ions, glucose, other stuff, will be accompanied by water because the concentration differential caused by the movement of solutes will also drive the movement of water along with it to sort of equalize that concentration difference. So, returning to this diagram, the absorption of sodium, glucose, and other molecules drives water to move out of the lumen into the cells with the solutes like sodium and glucose. And this water loss is actually necessary to avoid liquid stool. Remember that naturally the chyme, or the digested food that reaches the small intestine, it's basically liquid, right? You've got all this mashed up digested food, you've got gastric enzymes, you've got pancreatic secretions, you've basically got liquid, right? And by removing water, as you absorb sodium, glucose, all these nutrients, you pull water along with those things and you dry out the stool and get it to a more like solid poop consistency. But as you can tell, there are two halves to this picture, and while there is absorption, there also critically is secretion. There is secretion of chloride in the intestinal epithelium, which, in the same way that pulling in sodium pulls in water, pushing out chloride also pushes out water. And you might wonder, isn't this a waste? We're pulling in water, pushing out water. What's the point? The point is that if we only pull in water, the intestinal villi epithelium gets a little too dry. And we don't want to get too dry because we want a little bit of moisture to lubricate the passage of food. We don't want food to get stuck. And that's what that chloride secretion does. By chloride pushing out, pushing fluid with it, it helps lubricate the intestinal epithelium to help food move along. It also helps maintain an aqueous environment for the action of enzymes. It also helps hydrate that mucosal barrier of the epithelium to prevent breaches. So in short, it's kind of like Goldilocks, right? You don't want too much or too little. You want it just right. Not too wet or too dry, just right. And sort of as you can kind of intuit, this means that the balance and the calibration between absorption and secretion is of utmost importance, especially because we're dealing with such large volumes of water. Any imbalance in absorption and secretion can lead to significant physiological consequences, and one of those consequences is diarrhea. And here's where secretory diarrhea comes in. We want to think of secretory diarrhea as a net secretion of stuff into the lumen, in this case, stuff being water and associated solids. And the way you want to think about this is you're dialing up secretion and shutting down absorption. Imagine upregulating these chloride channels to push more chloride in the lumen. What's going to come along with it? Water. Shutting down these absorptive channels to stop solids from coming into the cells from the lumen and therefore stopping water from leaving the lumen into the cells. And the net result is more water in the lumen. More water in the lumen means that chyme stays super liquidy. So once that reaches the colon can't reabsorb all that water. There's still going to be a lot of water left in there. So once that person defecates, that stool is going to be very liquidy, also known as diarrhea. So understanding this pathophysiology of secretory diarrhea is important because it helps us elicit some key clinical features of it. For one, secretory diarrhea does not get better when you stop eating certain thing. Why? Because it's generally caused by a bacteria, say E. coli, or a hormone. And these things are longer lasting, right? They continue to precipitate this electrolyte imbalance. It's also, secretory diarrhea is also associated with dehydration and other symptoms, which makes sense, right? Because as we saw in this diagram here, you're literally losing water. You're pushing more chloride, which is pushing water from the cell into the lumen. You're losing water. That's sort of the definition of dehydration. And because, again, it's often associated with infection, there's generally often some other symptoms too, like fever. And lastly, and very importantly, secretory diarrhea causes high stool sodium. Going back to this diagram, by shutting down the absorption of sodium and thereby keeping a lot of water in the lumen, you also keep a lot of sodium in the lumen. And therefore, once that's, chyme goes to the lumen and gets defecated out, you will have more sodium in the stool. And all these features are important because it helps us distinguish secretory diarrhea from osmotic diarrhea. So osmotic diarrhea is like what you get if a lactose intolerant person drinks a lot of milk, right? Because you can't break down the lactose, you have a lot of concentration of lactose in the lumen. That high intraluminal concentration keeps water in it. Same principles of osmosis. Water doesn't want to leave because concentration in the lumen is so high. But generally, the way you can distinguish between the two is one, if you stop drinking milk and you're lactose intolerant, the diarrhea should get better, right? Because there isn't lactose keeping that high intraluminal concentration up. Also, there's limited dehydration because you don't get the sort of chloride transport and chloride water loss, associated water loss that you get in secretory diarrhea. And there's lower stool sodium, right? Because you aren't affecting sodium reabsorption by drinking milk if you're lactose intolerant. You're simply just keeping water in there. So the stool sodium should be lower in comparison to secretory diarrhea. So I hope this sort of made sense. I hope this compare and contrast made sense, but sort of in short, stepping back, The pathophysiology of secretory diarrhea is an increase in net secretion of water into the intestinal lumen via alterations in electrolyte and solute movement across the intestinal epithelium, right? And with that pathophysiology covered, I actually want to talk about a causative agent of the secretory diarrhea, which is ETEC. At first, I want to take a step back and remind you that ETEC is one of many strains or pathotypes of E. coli, and many of them actually aren't actually pathogenic. E. coli is a natural resident of our GI tract, and many strains are sort of those good bacteria that just chill out there and help us out. But E. coli gets a bad name because of the pathogenic subtypes. So even stepping away from the intestinal issues, UPEC, this E. coli strain is the most common cause of UTI, and NMEC is a very common cause of infant meningitis. So that's E. coli doing damage outside the GI tract. But inside the GI tract, generally, E. coli causes diarrhea. And today we're going to focus on enterotoxigenic E. coli, or ETEC. When we think about the clinical presentation of ETEC, the most common one you hear about is, you see on the screen here, traveler's diarrhea. What does that mean? It involves individuals traveling to foreign countries, generally with sometimes poor sanitation, them eating contaminated food, and then them getting diarrhea. But you don't really need to go to a foreign country to sort of get this sort of diarrhea. Take me and my spoiled, weak stomach and drop me in New York City. The truth is, if I'm in New York City, I'm like a moth to the flame. I am going to the flame of those dirty water hot dogs. Listen, I know they're not the greatest, but I think they taste pretty good, right? So I ate a dirty water hot dog. It turns out, unfortunately, those dogs may not be 100% hygienic. And the next day, I don't feel very good. And I end up spending, a couple days on the toilet. That's traveler's diarrhea in a nutshell. Generally, a self-limited diarrhea caused by ingestion of contaminated food or water, especially when you travel, right? And again, dumb illustrative anecdotes aside, let's get serious and talk about sort of this clinical presentation here. ETEC is transmitted by the fecal-oral route, which means the risk for transmission include eating contaminated food and water, direct person-to-person contact, or even swimming in contaminated water. Once infected, there's an incubation period around 10 to 17 hours before symptoms present, and those symptoms are generally acute water diarrhea that can cause severe dehydration. Again, it's secretory diarrhea, what we talked about before, you're losing a lot of chloride, pushing a lot of chloride, and then losing a lot of water as a result. And in unfortunate cases without supportive care or in vulnerable individuals like children, this dehydration can lead to death. There are an estimated 220 million cases each year worldwide, and as I sort of alluded to before, this can be very dangerous. There are an estimated 18,700 to 42,000 deaths caused by ETEC in children under 5 worldwide. And that's really important to understand because while many individuals in the US say, for me, ETEC might just be a self-limited traveler's diarrhea. For others, more vulnerable populations, ETEC is a very serious threat. It's a very serious threat that's often the first enteric or intestinal illness that infants encounter in their lives. And due to research limitations, due to limited supportive care, this ETEC infection can be deadly. But how does it do damage? That leads us to talking about ETEC's pathophysiology, which will help you know what we talked about, secretory diarrhea, and also the clinical presentations that we just talked about now. Helps sort of unite that when we learn about the pathophysiology here of ETEC. First, though, in the pathophysiology is you have to ingest ETEC, right? You ingest the E. coli bacteria, fecal-oral transmission, so you eat some food that's contaminated. The bacteria then will go down your esophagus, go down your stomach, and end up in your small intestine. And in the small intestine, ETEC uses these colonization factors, which are these like green hair-like projections off the bacteria you see in this diagram here. These colonization factors help attach itself to the epithelium of the small intestine. And these colonization factors are very interesting. They actually can be specific for specific epithelial features such as carbohydrate receptors. And this specificity allows for E. coli to preferentially target areas where it wants to attach and colonize. And once it's attached, E. coli secretes two key enterotoxins, heat labile toxin and heat stable toxin. They're named this way because, as the name suggests, heat labile ones are inactivated by heat. Heat stable ones remain active at high temperatures. Let's first talk about heat labile toxin. Heat labile toxin, seen here, is secreted in a sort of membrane vesicle that binds the epithelial membrane and then internalized by the cell. Ultimately, after processing through the ER and the Golgi seen here, a subunit of this labile toxin ends up activating adenyl cyclase. And activation of adenyl cyclase dials the production of CAMP, and more CAMP activates protein kinase A, which upregulates what you see here, the CFTR chloride channel, which if you remember from our previous discussion, the CFTR chloride channel is a key regulator of secretion of chloride in the lumen. So by upregulating CFTR, you increase chloride secretion in the lumen, increase water moving into the lumen. Heat-stable toxin, on the other hand, is a peptide that is directly bound to membrane-bound guanylyl cyclase seen here, the sort of orange thing. Binding activates additional conversion of GTP to cyclic GMP seen here. And cyclic GMP does two things. It upregulates CFTR, just like heat labile toxin, to increase chloride secretion in the lumen, but it also blocks the NHE3 transporter, which, going back to this diagram, is seen here. NHE3 is a sodium proton exchanger, and blocking, or CGMP blocking NHE3 inhibits this movement of sodium into the cell. So by stopping sodium absorption, what do you prevent? Increased water being absorbed into the cell, which means more water in the lumen, helping cause diarrhea, but also impeding sodium absorption. So that was a lot. And for a summary, I just want to summarize here, how does this work quickly? Colonization factors on ETEC bind epithelium. Heat labile toxin upregulates adenylyl cyclase to ultimately upregulate CFTR and secrete chloride and water into the lumen. Heat stable toxin upregulates guanylyl cyclase to also upregulate CFTR, but also block NHE3, which blocks sodium reabsorption and, of course, the absorption of water as a result. So understanding this, to me, helps sort of unite a lot of stuff we were talking about today. ETEC is textbook secretory diarrhea, right? Secretory diarrhea is caused by electrolyte transport imbalance. That's the definition of what we're doing here. Heat labile, heat stable toxin affect the chloride secretion and the sodium reabsorption. And that leads to more water in the lumen and therefore more watery stool, which is diarrhea. And importantly, the fact that we're putting more water in the lumen from the body explains the dehydration, right? ETEC's toxins help push chloride and water in the lumen, prevent sodium from being brought in and water as a result. So more water in the lumen explains the dehydration and explains why, if you don't have supportive treatment, if you don't have effective rehydration, this can be dangerous, especially in a vulnerable individual like a child in a resource-limited area, right? So what may be an unfortunate trip to the bathroom for me or someone in the United States could be very deadly for others. It's important to understand. That makes sense given what we understand of the pathophysiology of ETEC. And I do think it's important to remember that understanding what we've talked about today explains where interventions can be of use, right? Improving sanitation, improving standards of living, and of course, improving medical and supportive treatments for those that are infected are very important and can save lives. And additionally, research into new vaccines against ETEC, often targeting the toxins or the colonization factors, are another promising intervention option. As we mentioned before, the causes of infection are very high. Lots of people are, especially kids, are unfortunately passing away. So really, all these interventions are of utmost importance where ETEC is rampant and doing harm. So let's take a step back and summarize. What did we talk about today? 1, secretory diarrhea is caused by excess water in the intestinal lumen, which is really driven by disturbances in epithelial electrolyte transport. 2, ETEC most commonly causes traveler's diarrhea and is a leading cause of infant mortality in lower and middle-income countries, linked to, of course, the diarrhea and the attendant dehydration. And lastly, when it comes to pathophysiology, ETEC's toxins increase chloride secretion in the lumen and decrease sodium reabsorption, causing secretory diarrhea that, of course, leads to dehydration and all the problems we talked about before. So I hope this was at least somewhat informational, maybe a little entertaining. Regardless, here are my sources. Thank you so much. Have a good one. All right. Bye-bye.